Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Laurent Burin-Desrosiers. I'm the director of the Institut français in London. I'm very pleased to welcome you all for this wonderful evening. As you all know, Manet is now in London, as he used to be in Paris regularly a few years ago, the talk of the town, thanks to the magnificent exhibition organized at the Royal Academy of Arts. And therefore, we thought it was a great occasion to discuss and elaborate on this great artist. So I would like to thank Marianne Stevens, the curator of the exhibition Manet Portraying Life at the Royal Academy. Stéphane Guégan was the curator 2 years ago of the exhibition Manet Inventeur du Moderne in Paris at the Musée d'Orsay. And their discussion will be moderated by the art historian Richard Cork. So I want you to give them, I will ask you to give them a big applause and to thank them for being here tonight. Just another word to tell those of you who come maybe here for the first time that we are planning to have a regular program about art history and contemporary art. And indeed, the Tuesday, April the 9th, we'll have contemporary artist, French artist Jacques Villeglé in conversation here on this stage. That will be quite a unique occasion, inspired by the fact that he will have a personal exhibition at the Myers Gallery at the same time. So please come back very often. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight, not only because of my companions, but also because Manet has had a very special place in my affections for many, many years, going right back to when I was a teenager and I first discovered him in the Courtauld Gallery in Woburn Square. Do you remember that? Does anybody here remember the Courtauld in Woburn Square? Yes, thank you. Oh, quite a few hands are going up. And what a revelation it was to go up in the rickety old metal lift to the empty gallery. There was nobody there, apart from a guard. And apart from Manet, I mean, it was just a revelation, wasn't it, to discover him and to feel the need immediately to go over to Paris and learn more and see more. And now, of course, we're almost being spoilt by Marianne's wonderful exhibition at the Royal Academy. And Stéphane, I mean, it's fascinating that you decided over in Paris to call your exhibition Manet, the man who invented modernity. Because although I understand exactly why you've called it that, the truth, of course, is that the man we're discussing tonight is not only the man who invented modernity, but somebody who is incredibly complicated, isn't he? Almost to the point where even the greatest experts would say he was a man of mystery. Marianne, would you go along with that?
Yes, I think I would absolutely agree with that. One of the fascinating but tantalizing and you could almost say irritating aspects of Manet is that as you wrestle with trying to understand what he's doing in painting after painting, pastel after pastel, you realize that at the one hand, he seems to be clutching you by the scruff of your neck and forcing you to have to look because he is so insistent, he's so extraordinary and so powerful. And yet at the same time, he's pushing you away. He seems to suggest you may think that you've now understood what, for example, the portrait of Zola might be about, but actually, it's not that simple. And there are, as you begin to peel through the layers, you still don't quite get there. He slips through your fingers. And of course, I suppose that's one of the things that makes him such an exceptional painter, because you constantly have to come back to him. But also, I think it's one of the reasons why we do start looking at him in terms of modernity, of what issues he's addressing in relation to the idea of modernity.
Stéphane, he had a very correct and traditional bourgeois upbringing, didn't he? He was born into a very comfortable middle-class family, 1832, and his father couldn't have been more respectable, really, could he? He was a senior civil servant.
He was a public servant. and of the highest rank. And his background was very bourgeois, as you said. But before telling more about that, his background, his cultural background, even his political background, because the family was close to the Republican circles. If I can say a word about the title, which has been given to my show, because I was not responsible for that.
You were not responsible for the title.
It was more the result of a hard discussion between my manager and me. But in a way, we wanted to underline the fact that the time had come to break away from the modernist vision of Manet and to look at more closely at what Manet had in common with modernity, Baudelaire, Gautier, even the transformation of the society. So the main goal was to replace Manet in this context. So it's not modernism, but modernity, as Baudelaire decided to define it in the 60s. I think it was in tune with that, more than the 20th century vision of him.
How important was politics to him, do you think, Marianne?
I think it was very important. I just wanted to pick up one more word, because this modernity thing is really fascinating. There was an enormous amount of pressure also being brought to bear on me as I was working on the exhibition, which is currently at the Royal Academy, about, where is Manet's place within modernism? And time and again, I, like Stefan, was pushing back from that and saying, no, I don't want to deal with the modernism issue. It pushes it. We're seeing Manet too much from the 20th century backwards. And what I wanted to do was to really locate Manet, which I think is what you did wonderfully in your exhibition. Manet firmly within the 19th century. He was a product of the 19th century, and he lived at a particular time, and he responded to a number of discussions, debates, issues in his own very particular way, and tackles the issue of modernity in a number of, using a number of different, agendas or strategies.
Yeah. Well, I fully agree with that. And I always been struck by a fact when he decided to undertake his career, even his training. He chose Thomas Couture studio, and this choice was very strategic. At that time, the late 40s, during the Second Republic, for many reasons. We don't have time to explain all that, but he stayed in the studio 6 years. 6 years. He took his time to launch his career by a big painting on view at the Salon, because he was rich enough, and I'm returning to your question, he was rich enough to take his time to travel. He traveled and he went to Italy in 1853. He made many copies.
He went to South America, didn't he? As a merchant marine?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, when he was a teenager?
Was a teenager. Yeah. And it's interesting to read in the letters he sent to his mother. Essentially, that he had this skill for making caricatures, So that means that he had a sort of artistic education before getting on board, in a way.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, he was looking very keenly, wasn't he, at a lot of older art, in particular Dutch art. He absolutely adored Frans Hals in particular, didn't he? And over in Spain, he was fascinated by Spanish painting, and I think in particular Velázquez. Would you say, Marianne?
Absolutely. I find it so interesting when you look at his training, and as Stefan says, it's 6 years, and he's going through
It's a long
basically...
time, isn't
It's
it?
a long time, and he's going through a strictly academic training. He's learning to copy after the plaster cast, after the antique. He's learning to draw from the nude model. Absolutely what had been done for the previous 300 years. There's no change in that regard. And also being advised, quite correctly, by Couture to go to the Louvre, to copy the old masters. Sometimes they were correctly attributed, sometimes they have been reattributed to perhaps a lesser artist, but that isn't so much the important point. The point is, who did he choose to copy? And alongside copying the paintings, which tended to be northern 17th century, so it's Rubens, it's Franz Hals, it's also looking at, and Metsu and people like that. I mean, he's very wide in what he looks at. He's also going to what I suppose we call more a painterly tradition, rather than the linear tradition of Raphael and his followers, if you like. But alongside that also, I think you're dealing with an artist who had a kind of appetite for images. And so he also looks at prints. And of course, prints were circulating very widely after the old masters. He studies this Charles Blanc. He does all this in order to accumulate a wide range of options which he can draw upon in order to move forward to create his own style. And I think one of the things that's fascinating about this relationship to the old masters is the degree to which Manet is reliant upon those old masters as copy, but also the degree to which he uses those old masters as a springboard into creating something which is new and distinct.
The interesting thing is that, I mean, Stefan, you mentioned the caricaturist when he was young, which is very interesting, but when you think of Manet, when I think of Manet, I don't think of a drawing at all, I think of a painting. Would you say that yourself, that he's a painter rather than a draftsman?
Well, because most of the time we don't see any drawings by him in the shows, but I put a selection of them in the Paris show, and in the forthcoming Venice show there will be a selection of the drawings he made after the Old Masters, because the show is about that, his Italian background. But in Marianne's show, and I spent 2 hours in the show this afternoon, there's for example, there's a variation around the La Venere d'Urbino by Tiziano, and this variation is a portrait of a writer, composer, art critic, Zacharias Struck. Why Manet chose to took inspiration from Titian for, in order to do a portrait of someone who was close to Manet. Is there a meaning in the choice of, combining a reference to Titian and, one of the best examples of modernity of the 60s? This is the question we are now free to ask. Because before that, the only way to look at Manet was just saying, well, he opened the path to modernity, to the modern art, and from Manet to abstraction, there's a straightforward road. But it's not the case. I mean, Manet would have been surprised to hear that.
Yes, I'm sure he would. But of course, with hindsight, we walk around the Royal Academy show, Marianne, and we are totally fascinated, aren't we, by the whole question of finish and lack of finish, and the fact that we move from one painting to the next. One of the paintings is just almost impeccably finished, and you think, this guy knew everything about how to paint, and Couture must have taught him so much, even though he was a rebel. And then you move to the next painting, and you think, and nobody knows, do they, half the time, whether they're meant to be finished or meant to be half finished or what, because they contain these passages which, knowing 20th century and 21st century art as we do, we look at them and we think, oh my God, he is actually prophesying so much of what came afterwards. It's quite uncanny, isn't it?
One of the things that emerged when I was working on the exhibition was, in fact, having to address this whole question of finish and unfinished, or the degree to which a painting is resolved. And one of the things that surprised me, just as Stefan has been saying, one feels that everything has been said that has to be said about Manet, but in fact, one of the extraordinary things is that you go on finding new things and new issues that you have to address. And one of them was the surprise that a considerable amount of ink has been spilt and exhibitions been done on Cézanne and finish and unfinish, which is a kind of classic problem, and to a certain extent Monet as well. But Manet has not been addressed. And yet it is highly problematic. I mean, Richard, as you say, you can have an impeccably, seemingly finished picture, which is probably going to be presented to the Salon, like the Luncheon or the Portrait of Antonin Proust, or a painting that he wanted to have accepted by the Salon, and it was refused, like the Portrait of the Artist of Marcin Desboutins. But at the same time, you can have a painting that is seemingly so sketchy, and yet it went into the public domain, at least within the confines of Manet's own apartment, and would have been seen by his friends coming in to visit him. And so, what do you do with it? And I think that that's one of the extraordinarily fascinating things about this artist. He felt each painting, each work that he confronts, whether it's Olympia, whether it's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, whether it's Escape of Rochefort, whether it's the great religious paintings of 64 and 65, it's as if he starts completely from scratch and addresses the subject, and then he sets up a kind of triangular relationship between him, the subject, whether it's a sitter for a portrait or the model for Christ, and then himself. And it's him, the subject, and the painting. And that, again, is a very, I think, contemporary approach.
It is, isn't it? And he's also prepared, Stefan, isn't he, to take risks. I kept thinking, going around the show, he's a risk taker, isn't he? And then I was fascinated when I read the catalogue that Manet actually likened painting to swimming. And there's a wonderful quote about he thinks he's plunging headlong into the water when he paints. I mean, it's a wonderful idea, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it's a true. I think, well, it's really true. There's a passage in one of the two articles written by Mallarmé about that. Mallarmé was fascinated with this capacity of Manet of not repeating himself, of never repeating himself. He summarized that in saying, one painting, one idea. And this is something what I found again in walking around at the Royal Academy this afternoon. There's a diversity, and it's not because Manet kept, looking for the final formula, but because he kept adapting his language to the subject matter and to the context.
He didn't believe in formula, did he?
No. He was not a formalist painter, and he was not an impressionist one.
No.
It was he tried to find he tried to invent something which might confront the whole masters. He has the Louvre on mind. He was like that, like his master, and so our vision of him has changed throughout the 20th century. But in the late 19th century, when he died, the vision of his circle was so different. And I think it's not, returning to that is not enough to rethink Manet's career and Manet's aesthetic, but it's just a start to get rid of the formalist and the modernist vision of. And I think we share that this intention to refresh, our vision of Manet, because at the beginning, he started a very normal career, very normal. He was a normal guy.
That's right, and it's only later, really, that he becomes friends with some of the Impressionists, at least. Although, of course, we tend to lump him with the Impressionists now, or maybe we used to, and we're moving out of that. But for many years, art history books used to just sort of say Manet and the Impressionists. The truth is, Marianne, isn't it, that he never actually exhibited with them. He always sort of said, okay, I like you and I like your work, but il dit non.
Yes, he really did decline. He declined. And I think it's really very fascinating because it reveals so much of how he felt he should establish himself as an artist and establish his art within a context. And to go into cahoots with the Impressionists, they invited him to exhibit at the first Impressionist exhibition held in April of 1874, and he refused, even though by then he was good friends with Monet. He'd used Monet as a model on more than one occasion. He was going to paint Monet's portrait of Monet and his family in the summer of 74. He was collecting their work. He lent works by the Impressionists to that exhibition and subsequent exhibitions, Impressionist exhibitions. There were 8 in all. So he was not in any sense disregarding them or not feeling any inclination that what they were doing had no relevance to him, but he wanted, I think, to cut his own path, which he saw quite specifically was related to the salon, wouldn't you think?
Yes. I think he was eager to get a sort of official recognition, public recognition. And there's another reason why he kept showing his painting at the salon and trying to do so. Something I try to address in my catalog, and I think it had to do with his Republican background, because in the 70s, during the Third Republic, there was a lot of art critics who underlined the fact that the salon was the only place to address the public. And there were even Castagnari, who was previously close to Courbet, didn't like the Impressionists' strategy. He thought that these painters, despite the difficulties to put their paintings on view at the salon, had to keep this in mind and not to find, in a way, an easier way to display their painting. So the salon for the Republic, art critics and painter remained the place to address the largest audience. So it had to do with his own agenda, but it had to do with the context of the Third Republic as well.
He also had to be very brave, didn't he, Marianne? Because he was reviled time and again when his work did go on show. He was reviled by critics, wasn't he? And subjected to an incredible amount of anger and scorn, which actually must have been very tough for him, wasn't it?
Well, yes, sort of two parts to that. He was certainly, every time he made it into the salon, he would receive, on the whole, a majority of extremely negative critical response. There were the few key supporters, Zola, Mallarmé and so on, amongst them, Gautier early on, although Gautier didn't understand later on quite what he was up to. And I'll come back to that in a minute because it's very interesting. But it was very tough. Yeah. And I think there are a number of reasons for it. My hunch, or my interpretation, more than a hunch, is that one of the difficulties that Manet presented to the vast body of critics, and one has to remember it was a body that was growing significantly during this period. The role of the critic becomes a major component as the mediator between the art that was on the walls of the salon and this huge public that crowded into the exhibitions. But the trouble with Manet's presentations to the salon was that they were so varied stylistically, because he wasn't, going back to your point earlier, Stéphane, we agree he wasn't an artist who painted consistently. He's not like an officially accepted salon painter like a Carolus Durand, who once Carolus Durand found his way into portrait painting, you can never mistake a Carolus Durand portrait when it goes into the salon, whether it's in the mid-60s or the mid-70s or the early 80s or the later 80s. There's a consistency all the way through. Whereas with Manet, not only did he stylistically vary from one painting to another, from one year to another, but also he had the audacity, a lot of them felt, not to finish the pictures. So there were critics, for example, who would talk about one of the great paintings about Morisot, which alas we don't have in the exhibition here, it was in America, Le Repos, who even raised the question, is this finished? Is it an esquisse? Yeah. And so it was this problem, both in terms of technique, also in terms of subject matter. They didn't understand. What was the railway about, the chemin de fer? Is it a double portrait? Is it a genre scene? Or was it the portrait of the backside of a little girl?
And where is the train?
And where is the train? Yes, exactly.
That's a very good point.
Utterly puzzling. Yeah.
One of the 5 sections of Marianne's show, the Royal Academy, shows that very clearly. From the beginning, Manet tried to get in contact with the best writer of the time, but most of them were art critics. And he knew that he was going to need their help, their support, because he was aware of the novelty of his style. But on the other hand, I think there is still much to find and to discuss about Manet's and literature, modern literature, because, as you know, he made 3 books, more than 3 books, about 3 very known books with Mallarmé and Charles Cros. He had a project with Banville, who wrote a great piece on Le Repos in 1873, saying, well, Baudelaire has always loved this painter, and I understood why in front of his painting. So he has this background, but this encounter, Manet-Baudelaire, is more than just how can I put that? It's more than an encounter. It's because Manet understood that Baudelaire was the one who summed up the spirit of the time, introduced a new aesthetic, and something I said many times when the show was in Paris. In a way, Manet wanted to be the Delacroix of the new painting, trying to address each topic of the old tradition and to update all the genre. And this is something which is clearly underlined at the Royal Academy. And because on one hand, he tried to update every genre of the painting, but on the other, he took the liberty of merge them. And it's fantastic.
And all is not what it seems, is it? Because even when you look at a portrait, an early portrait-ish, like the extraordinary one of Zola, which is very highly finished, I think we can fairly say, and you think, okay, this is Manet at his most traditional in one sense, but of course it's Zola, who is a radical. It's Zola, who actually was a childhood friend of Cézanne, and you think, oh my God. And the more you look at that painting, the more you realize that it's about Manet as well, isn't it? It's about all his obsessions with other artists in reproductions and prints on the wall behind Zola. Yeah. And as you say yourself, it's about writing as well as about painting. I mean, so many things end up crowding. Marianne, your mind must have been crowded out at times.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier. You get to the point where you think you've almost got what Manet is honoured, and then he sort of slips through your fingers. But the Zola is a really interesting case, because I was thinking again about the Couture-Manet relationship, then I'll come back to Baudelaire. But that if you think that Couture did a portrait of Michelet, which is really interesting because it fits absolutely within the traditional representation of the writer. He sits in a chair at a table, maybe there's some writing instruments on the table, and he has book on the floor and a book that he's got open, which he's reading. It doesn't indicate that it's an illustrated book or anything like that. So the assumption in our mind is it must be a book by Michelet himself, which is the traditional way of representing the writer, just as you would a composer holding a sheet of composition that they've just done, or an architect with a drawing. But when Manet gets to deal with Zola, what does he do? He has Zola opening up with a book open on his lap, but it's not a text by Zola, it's not one of the Rougon-Macquart series, which he'd written 2 by then, but it's actually a recently published volume of etchings by Goya after Velázquez. And you find yourself thinking, this doesn't have much to do with Zola, but it has everything to do with Manet. And so it's actually Manet basically making the portrait say as much about him as it is about what Zola has achieved. And it's that constant playing off against tradition, because certainly Zola is seated at a writing table, so in that sense he's like Michelet. But at the same time, he subverts it to serve a different purpose. But can I just go back to the Baudelaire point?
Yeah.
Don't mind? I thought one of the really fascinating things about your exhibition, Stéphane, was when you encountered this issue of Manet's relationship to contemporary literature, in particular in relation to Baudelaire, where you're discussing that rather than trying to, as we would say in English, shoehorn Manet into fitting Baudelaire's description of what a painter of modern life should be, which actually is Constantin Guis, who was a caricaturist and a fashion painter rather than a serious artist like Manet. I don't want to do down Constantin Guis, but he's rather different. And he was a good friend of Manet. Manet made a wonderful pastel portrait of him, so let's not get that wrong. But at the same time, you make the point, which I think is incredibly important, that what Manet is seeking to do is to find a pictorial equivalent for the innovation in literature that Baudelaire was undertaking at the same time. So you put the Petit Poème en prose, the Spleen Paris, alongside, which is the prose poems, alongside what Manet is doing in the early 60s, and you then really begin to understand where and why the changes that were taking place in contemporary literature are directly apposite to what was happening with Manet. And you can go on and elaborate that further with the relationship with Mallarmé, I think.
Stéphane, is it true to say that Manet was an omnivorous reader?
Sorry?
Was he an omnivorous reader? Do you understand
Reads everything.
omnivorous? No. A kind of very greedy reader. Always reading, Manet?
Always reading?
Reading?
Very well
reading?
read.
Yeah.
I think so. I think so because, for example, as soon as he received the novels by Zola, he read it, and he sent a letter to the writer saying, "Well, it was a great experience. It's so lively. You're the best." You know? If you turn to what he did with Mallarmé, it's always very sophisticated. So it didn't want to illustrate, and it's very difficult to illustrate literally Mallarmé's poems, but he wanted to give an equivalent in a visual terms. Mallarmé was overwhelmed, but by what Manet did, and this friendship was so tense, and it's just something which is clearly shown in the Royal Academy exhibition, is the iconography of the writer in Manet's painting changed a lot throughout the 70s. If you look at Zola, as Marianne has just recalled, it's very traditional. Yeah. If you can, as I'm going to do that in Venice, you can put alongside, a painting from the Quattrocento, But in the case of Mallarmé, it's very different. It's more latent. You have to know Mallarmé to consider that as a writer, because everything is in the smoke of his cigar, because the book is open, but it might be just a reader, and in terms of hierarchy, it's interesting because Zola maybe had a bigger importance. If you think about Manet in terms of scale, Zola is a big scale salon painting. It's like, yes, we're sharing many things. You supported me when I went through difficulties.
Yeah.
And in regard to that, I wanted to thank you. It's a grateful painting. But in the case of Mallarmé, it's a smaller painting. It's more intimate, and everything is about how to suggest that Mallarmé is the greatest poet of the late 70s.
Marianne, can I ask you about music? Because, of course, one of the things in the Academy show is that you come across these delightful portraits of Manet's wife playing the piano. Manet's wife, who, before she was Madame Manet, had been teaching the Manet family to make music. And then, of course, he marries her, not only paints her playing the piano, but must have listened to music a lot. Is that true?
Yes, I think music is rather like a leitmotif that weaves its way through Manet's entire career. His mother was a musician, we know, and was better than just the average amateur pianist who learned the piano because it was part of the social accomplishments. So there must have been music in the home. But then when he marries, well, first of all, has the affair with, and then marries Suzanne Linhoff, who'd moved to Paris in the mid-1840s, probably already as a trained musician. We don't know where she trained, which is something I would love to know.
She was Dutch, wasn't she?
She was Dutch.
Yes.
She came from Holland, and she moved with her family to Paris. And she then moves into the circle of the Manets because she's taken on to teach the piano to Manet's two younger younger brothers. Sorry, let's get the relationships right. And from that point onwards, she's really a presence, obviously, in Manet's life, and she is performing not on the public stage. She's teaching until she gets married, but she also plays the piano both at the Manet family soirées, of which there were 2 a week on Tuesdays and Thursday evenings, and also at other soirées and salons around Paris. These were these very cultured gatherings of writers, critics, collectors, musicians, politicians, and so on. And we know that Madame Manet was there accompanying, either playing duets with Madame Meurice or accompanying Fanny Claus, whose portrait is in the exhibition. She was a very talented violinist. And also a wonderful moment where we have a record of Madame Manet going with Madame Meurice to play to Baudelaire as he lay dying from syphilis, and playing him Schumann and Wagner. And if there was anything more contemporary or modern, it's rather like playing late Birtwistle and probably Cage, as it were, in this day and age. I mean, these were literally at the edge of what people could comprehend as being acceptable music. And I think it's very interesting that Madame Manet is perfectly comfortable and engaged with that music. She understands its implications.
And of course, I mean, one thinks about portraiture throughout your fascinating show. You think about, well, one of the things I thought about was what it must have been like to sit for Manet. And it turns out, doesn't it, that very often it wasn't much fun, Marianne, was it? That he could actually drive his sitters pretty well nuts, because, I mean, he would spend a fairly, from the sitters' point of view, grueling day painting them, and then he would actually destroy everything that he'd done that evening and start all over again. And they would end up quite desperate, wouldn't they, and plead with him to let well alone and to finir.
It is very interesting. There's evidence in just the range of portraits that I've gathered together at the Royal Academy of portraits that were probably done in a single sitting. I'm certain that's the case with the portrait of Berthe Morisot en deuil, in mourning. It's this very black, angry, extraordinarily intense painting, where the paint has been put on with great swathes of brush
Almost
stroke.
like an expressionist painting, isn't it?
It is. It hovers right into the early 20th century, I agree, entirely. And it is trying to encapsulate this moment of absolute tragedy, which this woman feels in the wake of the death of her father. But at the other end of the scale, you can have a painting like the Antonin Proust portrait, which he started on many occasions and finally did it in a single sitting, except with the gloves. Or we have Zola, where Zola turned up over some 22 sittings and really got desperate because he couldn't understand why Manet hadn't got it.
He wanted to write.
Well, exactly. He thought it was a terrible waste of time by the end. But at the same time, I think it's interesting because Théo de Duret, whose portrait Manet also paints very shortly after he finishes the portrait of Zola, accompanied Zola for those sittings. And I think that for Zola, the situation was rescued by the fact that there was a kind of triangular conversation that could take place rather than just between Manet and Zola. But there are other instances, as a portrait that I didn't put into the exhibition of the critic Wolf, who was an odd relationship between Manet and him. He hadn't been terribly nice about Manet's work. And the portrait patently hasn't worked. And that was because there were literally some 20 sittings. And in the end, Wolf just writes saying, that's it. I'm not coming back. I can't cope with it anymore. And so it's left to one side. And it is an unresolved portrait. There's no question about that. And it was just left in the studio.
Well, maybe Manet decided that he didn't like this man at all and wanted to just punish him.
There may be that. Manet could certainly sort of prod when he needed to, but I think in this particular instance, he was very engaged with him early on because he actually gives an instruction which is very telling about Manet's relationship to his sitters. He gives them an instruction about what he wants them to wear. So he has an idea of how he wants this portrait to end up. And that intervention on the part of the portrait maker is very interesting because generally speaking, it's the other way around. When a portrait is commissioned, then it tends to be the sitter who decides how they want to present themselves, right down to how they're going to pose. But in the case of the majority of Manet's portraits, they're not commissioned. They are actually by invitation from Manet. And so he can take a much more interventionist approach, if you like, in terms of what they're going to wear and how they're going to sit, what pose they're going to take, and so on.
And quite clearly, from your exhibition, one of the most important sitters was, of course, this extraordinary woman, Victorine Meurent, who appears again and again. Not that you think immediately, oh, that's Victorine again, because Manet's not like that, is he? But, I mean, she is right at the centre of some of his absolute masterpieces, including, of course, the wonderful painting of the railway, which is in the Royal Academy. She also appears in such classics as the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, doesn't she? And even Olympia. Why do you think Manet was so preoccupied with Victorine? What do you think was so special about her?
I think the answer to that lies in the very first portrait, the portrait that he made of her before he started using her as a model. He does this astounding head and shoulders portrait of her with a little bandeau with a blue ribbon on her Titian hair. And what you read in that is what must have appealed to Manet. It wasn't her body, it was actually her face. And there is this almost hypnotic stare that she has, that he must have found absolutely mesmerizing, actually, because he applies it every time he uses her as a model. And so, in a sense, the key's set with that first picture. And having once understood what her face is made up of and has understood his way round her stare, he then applies it across, whether it's to the Street Singer, which is the first full-length, first genre painting that he makes of her.
That's an absolutely stunning painting, isn't it?
It's an extraordinary painting because it's of this woman who's just walked out of a night cafe, we assume, clutching a guitar in one hand, and in her other hand she is holding up some, what I think, I'm almost certain are cherries. I've looked very carefully at it on many occasions and hovered between grapes and cherries, but I think it's cherries. And she's patently very well dressed. She's wearing a very fashionable dress, showing her petticoat. She's
not a low-life woman, as the title Street Singer might suggest, is she?
Well, I think it's one of these areas where Manet is playing with low life, high life. He's dealing with a marginal figure as far as society is concerned, just as he was addressing absinthe drinkers or rag pickers or whatever. But at the same time, it's also, and I think the key is given in the palette, the colors that he's using, and also that she's clutching a guitar. It's a homage to Velázquez, because there you have him understanding absolutely the range of blacks and greys that Velázquez uses, this great Spanish 17th century painter whom he admired hugely. And at the same time also understands how Velázquez did not mediate gently from light to shadow, but actually has very sharp edges to light and shade, identified by these long drawn brush strokes of dark grey-black against lighter grey-grey. And all of it using the brushwork to model the form. It's the key, in some ways, for me, of that debt to Velázquez lies in that, and also in the palette. But again, at the way in which he understands that Velázquez was an artist who did things incredibly economically. And when you look at the moment at which Victorine, the street singer, picks up her dress and shows a corner of a white petticoat, he does it in 4 vertical brush strokes and a little kind of twist at the bottom, just to indicate the curve of the bottom of the petticoat. And it's that sort of thing that sent the critics mad. Because they couldn't understand, it's unfinished. What's he doing? It should be polished, but it isn't.
I started out this evening by saying that he was a man of mystery, or maybe even a Manet of mystery. Sorry about that. But I want to get as close as I can, now that we're reaching the end of the discussion, to the mystery. And of course it is very difficult, but one of the most fascinating, mesmerizing things about looking at Manet, for example, that amazing painting in room number 1 at the Royal Academy called The Luncheon. For example, that amazing painting in the final room at the Royal Academy, The Railway, where you have, well, The Luncheon in particular, you have several people. The title suggests that they've all had lunch together. The title suggests a social occasion. And you look at this painting and you think, actually, they're all alone. Each of those figures is somehow completely isolated in a strange kind of way within the social convention of a luncheon. And this happens time and again in some of Manet's most ambitious paintings, doesn't it? Do you think it reflects in the end on him as a person?
If Manet had written more, we might be able to answer that question. One of the great difficulties is that Manet conducted the vast majority of his conversations and discussions about aesthetics, literature, music, his thoughts on Wagner, for example, in social settings.
Yes, and he talked a lot, didn't he?
And he
Yeah.
talked a lot. I mean, he had these soirees at home, Tuesdays and Thursdays evenings. I mean, he was busy. But he also went out to the local cafe every day. And also received people in his studio. So there was no need to record in literary form because he was conducting the conversation socially. So we have a problem. I, however, think that actually, going back to this question of modernity, which you started with, one of the planks of Manet's program was to paint contemporary life. And in that sense, he was conforming to the reigning avant-garde aesthetic of the day and taking it to its logical conclusion. That's realism. You don't paint a scene from your imagination or a reconstruction or recreation of the past. You paint what is in front of you, what you are surrounded by. And that is how you reveal the truth, because it can be measured, it can be seen and recorded. But alongside that, he, and this goes back to Baudelaire and our wonderful Wagnerian friends, he's also wrestling with this problem of if you're painting contemporary life, you can no longer do it using the traditional artistic vocabulary. You have to invent a new visual vocabulary. And what is that new visual vocabulary? Is it merely doing a snapshot of the contemporary world, or is it actually taking art to another level? And I think what he begins to address, mediated in part through Baudelaire, I think, and to a certain extent Gautier, is what is it that makes up art? Painting is about description of the external world, but painting is also about the practical aspects of art. It's composition, it's form, it's color. And in these extraordinarily ambiguous, enigmatic paintings, like the luncheon or the railway station, the railway, the more you look at it, the more you realize that he's doing a number of things. First of all, he tends to be flattening out the composition. So although you are invited to think about depth in the railway, you can see the railway line behind in the cutting, but actually it's being negated by the railings that come in front. At the same time, you're
also by this extraordinary expanse of mysterious smoke.
Oh, yes, which is the reference to the railway. Yes. But at the same time, he's also picking up color. And there is this very small number of colors that are scattered across the entire surface of the canvas, both in the foreground, same color in the foreground as in the background. And the more you start looking at it, the more you realize that actually it's again flattening out the composition because it's denying recession, visual recession. And if you add to that the fact that he always leaves the mark of his brush on the surface of the canvas, we understand the construction of the painting is through the paint that's laid on the surface of the canvas. He is as much telling us about what the formal aspects of painting are as it is about description. And although he's never willing to entirely move into the world of patches of color creating abstraction, he is certainly prepared to address the implications of modernity in terms of formal construct as well as description.
And I must just ask you, the most mysterious figure of all, really, is the young man who, of course, dominates the painting of the luncheon and appears again and again in other paintings, for the very straightforward reason, of course, that he is the son of Manet's wife. But, of course, there has been endless speculation. His name is Léon. There has been endless speculation, which cannot ever be resolved, I don't think, that he might even be Manet's son, although never acknowledged as such. Mm-hmm. There's even been speculation that he could even be, the son of Manet's father? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like some sort of extraordinary novel, returning to this whole question of writing again, yes. Isn't it? It's like some extraordinary fiction surrounding the very figures that not only were painted by Manet, but lived with Manet in his house.
It is very, very mysterious. And I feel very sorry for Léon. And I suppose it's one thought that crosses my mind when I look at the painting of the luncheon, this image of an 18-year-old boy about to walk out into his first job, in fact. He's maturing.
He
But at the
looks
same
quite
time,
melancholy, doesn't
he does look quite melancholy. And in fact, I think I would too if every time I was introduced in public, I was introduced either as Manet's godson, which is true, or as Manet's young brother-in-law, because when he was introduced in public by his mother, he was introduced as her younger brother. Well, if there's anything that's going to cause confusion from a psychological point of view, I think you're certainly looking at a problem there. And again, it is, yes, you're right, it's part of this kind of mysterious element, which you would long to get to the bottom of, but we have no documentation to lead us any further than where we've got to date. And it may be that in the end, Léon was the son of this mysterious Monsieur Coella, whose name figures on the birth certificate, about whom we know absolutely nothing.
Fascinating. Yes. Yes. Well, to conclude, I always feel with Manet that it is an absolute tragedy that he died when he did. He died in 1883 at the age of 51, because actually, I think you'd agree, Marianne, wouldn't you, that he was at the height of his powers. There's no doubt about that at all. I mean, to end up with paintings like the Bar at the Folies Bergère and other extraordinary achievements. Marianne, I mean, it's an impossible question to answer, but I have to ask you, what might he have gone on to do? He could have lived till, what, 1910? Even later? He might have gone on, like his friend Manet, to an advanced old age. It is the most extraordinary thought, isn't it?
I think it's one of those great ifs of history. There's both a positive and negative side to it. The negative side is, had he not died at 51, the age of 51, after 3 to 4 years of really rapidly declining health, we probably wouldn't have had this extraordinary body of pastel portraits that he's making in the late 70s, which are astounding in terms of their technical expertise, their insight into both the sitter, but also what Manet was doing with portraiture at the end of the 70s. On the positive side, well, I suppose it's negative, but also let's now look forward. I find myself thinking he probably would have engaged with that next generation of writers that were led to pictorial symbolism, literary symbolism, through Mallarmé. I think he would have become very interested in the experimental work that was taking place in the 80s, in rethinking what theatre was about, what music was about, what art was about, which ultimately was going to lead to the mature Cézanne and, of course, post-impressionism in the form of pictorial symbolism of Gauguin. Whether he would have completely embraced that program, I don't know. But certainly, if you look at what he's producing from 1880 to 1882 inclusive, the great portrait of Antonin Proust in the Salon of 80, alongside Chez le Père Latuis, which is wonderful genre painting, which now sits in Tournai at the Musée des Beaux-Arts. And then you look at 1881, we have the marvelous painting of Printemps of Jeanne de Marcy, an incredible, small but gem-like tour de force. And then we have the Bar of Folies Bergère. And it does make you think, where would he have steamed to next? Absolutely. I mean, extraordinary, really. And, of course, what he leaves us with is an oeuvre of just over 400 paintings, in contrast to Monet, who lives until 86, the age of 86, and produces some 2,500.
Well, on that note, we must, I think, conclude, but one could quite clearly discuss Manet all evening, all weekend, all night. He is one of those inexhaustible painters, actually, and they're the best, aren't they, really? The ones who you return to again and again, and you realize that there's yet another dimension to them that hasn't occurred to you before. And that's really, I think, why we keep on looking. And that's really why the Royal Academy show, and congratulations, Marianne, on that. It's the most wonderful show. You can go to it again and again and discover more and more. And there's still time, guys. If you haven't been yet, do go. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you above all, Marianne, and of course Stefan, who had to catch a Eurostar, I'm afraid. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Richard, very much.